Some wounds never heal, and some men never forget the day their world burned down. For 16 years, Griff McAllister has lived alone on the edge of Bitter Creek Canyon, carrying scars that run deeper than flesh. The giant cowboy once ruled 3 territories with his gun. Then a blood feud changed everything. He swore never to speak more than he had to, never to let anyone close again. His cabin stands empty. His bed stays cold. Then one summer evening, Delilah Rose rides up to his door. The widow who runs the stage stop has a question that stops his heart. Is your bed still empty? For years, people feared him or forgot he existed. But here's Lila, asking the one thing that shakes his silent world. What could make a woman brave enough to approach the loneliest man in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between them like a canyon itself, wide and seemingly impossible to cross. Griff McAllister stood in his doorway, all 6 feet and 8 inches of him filling the frame, like a mountain blocking out the sky. His weathered hands gripped the door jamb so tight his knuckles had gone white, and those pale blue eyes that had once struck fear into the hearts of gunfighters from Texas to Montanasterd, at the woman before him, as if she were a ghost. But Delilah Rose was no ghost. She sat astride her chestnut mare with the kind of confidence that came from facing down life's hardest blows and coming out the other side still breathing. Her dark hair caught the golden light of the setting sun, and those curves that had caught more than one cowboy's attention were wrapped in a practical riding dress that spoke of a woman who worked for her living. At 34, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd loved deeply, lost everything, and somehow found the strength to keep going. "Well," she said, and her voice carried the warmth of honey, mixed with the steel of a woman who'd learned not to back down. "Are you going to answer me, or are we going to stand here until the coyotes start singing?" Griff's throat worked, but no sound came. 16 years. 16 years since he'd spoken more than the bare minimum to another human soul. The last real conversation he'd had was with his brother Jake on that blood-soaked morning when everything went to hell. Since then, he'd managed with nods, grunts, and the occasional yes or no when pressed. The townspeople had learned to leave him be. Even the preacher had stopped trying to save his soul. But here was Lila Rose, asking the one question that cut right through all his carefully constructed walls. His cabin stood behind him in the gathering dusk, as solitary and silent as the man who lived in it. Built from pine logs he'd cut himself in those first angry years after the feud, it perched on a rocky outcropping that gave him a clear view of anyone approaching from miles away. No surprises, no visitors, no complications, just the way he'd wanted it. The interior was sparse as a monk's cell, a single bed with military corners, a table and 1 chair, a stone fireplace that had warmed nothing but beans and coffee for more years than he cared to count. On the mantelpiece sat the only decoration in the Placia blood-stained Bible, where he'd sworn his oath of silence, his finger tracing the pages where his brother's blood had dried to brown stains 16 years ago. The Bible had been Jake's. His little brother, barely 22 and full of fire and righteous anger, had been reading from Ecclesiastes when the Murdoch gang had come calling. To everything there is a season. Jake had read aloud, his voice carrying that earnest quality that had always made Griff want to protect him from the world's ugliness. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Jake never got to finish the passage. The bullets that tore through the cabin wall saw to that. Now Griff's fingers twitched toward his throat, where the words he'd once spoken with such easy confidence had died along with his brother. He'd been known throughout 3 territories as a man whose word was his bond, whose voice could calm a spooked horse or rally men to action. The fastest gun between Denver and San Francisco, they'd said, but more than that, a man who stood for something. All of that had died with Jake. Lila shifted in her saddle, and the leather creaked in the evening stillness. She was studying him with those intelligent dark eyes, taking in the breadth of his shoulders beneath the faded work shirt, the way his dark hair had gone silver at the temples, the scars that marked his hands and face like a map of old battles. But there was no fear in her gaze, no pity either, which might have been worse. "I know you can hear me just fine," she said, and there was something almost gentle in her tone now. "Whole town knows about your condition. But I also know you're not addled in the head like some folks say. You're just carrying a burden too heavy for one man to bear alone." She was right about that, though he'd never admit it. Every morning he woke to the same routine: coffee black as midnight, biscuits hard as leather, because he'd never learned to make them right. Then out to tend the small herd of cattle that kept him fed and clothed, moving through his chores with the methodical precision of a man trying to fill the empty hours before nightfall brought the dreams. The dreams were the worst part. In them, Jake was always alive, always laughing, always asking questions about the future they'd planned together. They were going to build something, the McAllister brothers. Maybe start a ranch, maybe open a store. Jake had a head for numbers and a way with people that balanced out Griff's reputation with a gun. Together, they'd been unstoppable, until Clayton Murdoch decided they were in his way. The name still made Griff's jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. Clayton Murdoch, the self-proclaimed land baron who owned half of 3 counties and wanted to own the other half. Rich enough to buy judges and sheriffs, cruel enough to destroy anyone who crossed him, and smart enough to make it look legal. It was Murdoch who'd started the feud, claiming the McAllister spread sat on land that rightfully belonged to him. It was Murdoch who'd sent his hired guns to negotiate with bullets and fire. And it was Murdoch who'd ridden away untouched while Jake bled out in Griff's arms, whispering apologies for leaving him alone. The law had called it a boundary dispute gone wrong. Nobody wanted to hear about Murdoch's involvement, not when his money kept the town running and his influence reached all the way to the territorial capital. Griff had been advised to take his brother's body and move on, find somewhere else to make his peace with what had happened. Instead, he'd buried Jake on the hill behind the cabin and sworn an oath that would govern the rest of his days. No more killing, no more violence, no more getting close to people who might end up dead because of him. The silence would be his penance, and the loneliness would be his cross to bear. Now here sat Lila Rose, 34 years old and twice widowed, asking him to break that oath. She ran the stage stop in Bitter Creek, a rambling building that served as hotel, restaurant, and gathering place for travelers passing through the canyon. It was honest work, respectable work, but it kept her in the public eye in ways that made certain men think they had a right to her attention. Men like Clayton Murdoch, who'd been sniffing around her property for months now, making offers that weren't really offers and asking questions that weren't really questions. Everyone in town knew Murdoch wanted the stage stop. It sat at the narrowest part of the canyon, controlling the only practical route between the mining camps up north and the railroad down south. Whoever owned that piece of land could control the flow of commerce through the entire region. And if that someone happened to be Clayton Murdoch, he'd have the power to squeeze every independent operator out of business. Lila had been holding him off with wit and determination, but they both knew it was only a matter of time. Murdoch didn't take no for an answer, and he had ways of getting what he wanted that didn't always involve money. "I need protection," she said simply, as if reading his thoughts. "And you need someone to ask if your bed is still empty." The words hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed simple human conversation, the give and take of 2 minds meeting in understanding. For 16 years, he'd told himself the silence was enough, that the loneliness was what he deserved. But standing there in his doorway, looking at this remarkable woman who'd ridden all the way out to his place just to ask him the most personal question imaginable, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. Hope. It scared him more than facing down a dozen armed men ever had. The sun was sinking behind the canyon walls now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of better times. Times when he and Jake would sit on the porch of their old place, planning their future and watching the stars come out. Jake would have liked Lila, he realized. Would have approved of her directness, her courage, her refusal to be intimidated by life's hardships. "I can cook," she continued, as if his silence was answer enough for now. "I can keep house without fussing over every little thing. I can handle a rifle if it comes to that, and I won't ask you to be something you're not." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'm not looking for love, Griff McAllister. I'm looking for partnership. A fair trade between two people who understand that life doesn't always give you what you want, but sometimes it gives you what you need." Partnership. The word echoed in his mind as he stared at her, this brave woman who'd somehow found the courage to ride out to the loneliest place in the territory and propose to the most feared man in 3 counties. She wasn't asking him to be the man he used to be, she was asking him to be the man he might still become. Behind him, the cabin waited in its familiar emptiness. Ahead of him, Lila Rose sat on her horse like a promise he'd never dared to make. For the first time in 16 years, Griff McAllister found himself wanting to break his silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor when Lila returned, this time carrying a leather satchel and wearing her best dress, the deep blue one she'd saved from her wedding to her first husband. She'd spent the night at the stage stop, pacing her small room above the restaurant, second-guessing every word she'd spoken to the silent giant on the mountain. But Clayton Murdoch's ultimatum still rang in her ears. 3 days. That's all he'd given her to accept his generous proposal of marriage. After that, he'd promised, things would get unpleasant. She'd seen what unpleasant looked like when it came to Clayton Murdoch businesses that mysteriously burned down, accidents that befell those who opposed him, legal troubles that appeared from nowhere to destroy a person's livelihood. Griff stood in the same doorway where she'd left him, as if he hadn't moved all night. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair and highlighted the strong line of his jaw. He was a handsome man, she realized would have been devastating in his younger days, before the weight of sorrow settled on those broad shoulders. "I brought papers," she said without preamble, dismounting with practiced ease. "Figured you might want to see the terms written out proper before you decide." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a document she'd spent half the night writing by lamplight. The marriage contract thastily penned, but legally binding if they both signed it. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, but her voice remained steady. "It's a business arrangement," she continued, stepping closer to the porch. "I get protection from Murdoch and his kind. You get someone to cook decent meals and keep the place from falling down around your ears." She managed a small smile. "And maybe some conversation when you're ready for it." Griff's pale eyes fixed on the document, and she saw him reading each line with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust easily. The contract was simple and fair, a marriage of convenience with clear boundaries and mutual responsibilities. No false promises of love, no unrealistic expectations. Just 2 people agreeing to face their troubles together instead of alone. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Clayton Murdoch has been pressuring me for months. Yesterday he told me I had 3 days to marry him willingly, or he'd find ways to make me more cooperative." She lifted her chin, meeting Griff's gaze directly. "I'd rather take my chances with a ghost than give that snake what he wants." Something shifted in Griff's expression, a flash of the dangerous man he'd once been. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment she saw why people had once feared him. The protective rage that rose in his eyes was like watching a sleeping wolf wake up. "I know you can't speak much," she continued quickly, "but I need to know, will you do this? Will you marry me and help me keep Murdoch at bay?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with 16 years of accumulated pain and isolation. Griff stared at the contract, then at her face, then back at the paper. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, duty, warring with desire, isolation battling against the human need for connection. Finally, slowly, he reached for the contract. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, and she felt calluses earned through years of hard labor, scars from old fights, and a gentleness she hadn't expected. He studied the document again, reading every word twice. Then he looked up at her, and when he spoke, his voice was rusty from disuse, but unmistakably determined. Yes. The single word hung in the air between them, like a struck bell. Lila felt her knees go weak with relief, and she had to grip the porch railing to keep from swaying. It was the first word she'd heard him speak, and it carried the weight of a sacred vow. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Griff nodded once, then disappeared into his cabin. When he emerged, he carried a battered pen and a small bottle of ink. Without ceremony, he signed his name at the bottom of the contract, Griffin James McAllister, written in the careful script of a man who'd been educated before the world broke him. Then he handed the pen to her. Her own signature seemed to dance across the paper. Delilah Rose McAllister, Mrs. Griffin McAllister. The name felt strange but not unwelcome. "When?" she asked. "Today," he said, the second word coming easier than the first. "Before," he stopped, his jaw working as if the words were fighting him, "before he changes his mind about waiting." She nodded, understanding immediately. Murdoch was many things, but patient wasn't one of them. If they were going to do this, it had to be now, before he decided to take more direct action. "Reverend Walsh will perform the ceremony," she said. "He owes me a favor. He nursed his wife through pneumonia last winter." They rode into town together, an unlikely pair that set tongues wagging from the moment they appeared on Main Street. Griff on his massive black gelding, sitting straight in the saddle like the cavalry officer he'd never been but carried himself like one anyway. Lila, on her chestnut mare, her blue dress spread carefully to avoid wrinkles, her dark hair pinned up in a style that spoke of special occasions. The whispers followed them down the dusty street. "That's the McAllister hermit. Heard he ain't spoke in years. What's Lila Rose doing with the likes of him? Clayton Murdoch ain't gonna like this one bit." Reverend Walsh was tending his small garden behind the church when they found him. He was a thin, serious man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a reputation for asking few questions when people needed help. He looked up from his tomatoes as they approached, taking in their formal clothes and serious expressions. "Mrs. Rose," he greeted, then nodded cautiously toward Griff. "Mr. McAllister." "Reverend," Lila said, dismounting. "We need you to perform a wedding ceremony." Walsh's eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. "Today?" "Today," she confirmed. "Right now, if you're willing." The preacher studied them both for a long moment. "This is somewhat sudden, isn't it?" "Sometimes sudden is all you get," Lila replied. "Will you do it?" Walsh glanced at Griff, who gave a single, firm nod. "Very well. Let me get my book." The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted in the church's small sanctuary, with the afternoon sun streaming through the single stained glass window. Walsh spoke the traditional words with gentle dignity, and Lila found herself moved, despite the practical nature of their arrangement. When the Reverend asked if Griff would take Delilah to be his lawfully wedded wife, another yes emerged from the big man's throat, stronger this time. "And do you, Delilah, take Griffin to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "You may kiss the bride." Griff looked at her with something approaching panic, and Lila smiled reassuringly. Rising on her toes, she pressed a gentle kiss to his bearded cheek. His skin was warm, and she felt him tremble slightly at the contact. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Walsh intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." They were married. Just like that, Delilah Rose had become Mrs. Griffin McAllister, and the loneliest man in 3 territories had gained himself a wife. As they left the church, Lila spotted Clayton Murdoch's familiar figure standing outside the saloon, his cold eyes fixed on them with murderous intent. She slipped her hand through Griff's arm, feeling his muscles tense beneath her touch. "Let him look," she murmured. "He's too late now." Griff's gaze found Murdoch across the street, and for a moment the two men stared at each other, with 16 years of unfinished business crackling between them. Then Griff placed his large hand over Lila's, where it rested on his arm, a gesture of protection and possession that made Murdoch's face twist with rage. They'd thrown down the gauntlet now. There would be consequences, Lila knew. Murdoch didn't forgive, and he never forgot. But as they rode out of town together toward their new life, she felt something she hadn't experienced in Yearshope for the future, and the comforting presence of someone who would stand beside her against whatever storms were coming. The silence in the cabin had a different quality now, not the hollow emptiness of solitude, but the charged atmosphere of two people learning to share space. Lila stood in the doorway with her traveling bags, taking in the stark reality of what would be her new home. It was exactly what she'd expected from a man who'd lived alone for 16 years, functional, sparse, and utterly devoid of warmth. The single chair at the wooden table seemed to mock the idea of companionship. The narrow bed in the corner looked like it had been made with military precision every day for the past decade and a half. But it was the complete absence of any feminine touch that struck her most profoundly. No curtains softened the harsh angles of the windows. No rugs covered the rough wooden floors. No flowers, no decoration, nothing that spoke of a life being lived rather than simply endured. "I'll need to make some changes," she said quietly, setting down her bags. Griff stood by the fireplace, his large frame tense with uncertainty. He nodded once, then gestured helplessly at the space around them, as if to say he had no idea how to accommodate another person in his carefully ordered world. From her largest bag, Lila withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Her recipe box, the one thing she'd saved from each of her previous homes, containing the accumulated wisdom of her mother, her grandmother, and her own years of learning to make the best of whatever ingredients life provided. "First things first," she said, carrying the box to the kitchen area. "A proper meal." She found his pantry stocked with the basics: flour, beans, coffee, salt, pork butt, nothing that spoke of cooking as anything more than fuel for survival. The cast-iron stove was functional but clearly underused, its surface dull with neglect. As she worked, pulling ingredients together for a simple but hearty stew, she was aware of Griff watching her every movement, not suspiciously, but with the fascination of a man seeing magic performed. The way she diced onions with quick, efficient strokes, how she seasoned the meat with herbs from small paper packets in her recipe box, the careful attention she paid to the timing and temperature. "My grandmother taught me," she said, not looking at him but knowing he was listening, said a woman who could cook would never starve, and a woman who could cook well would never be lonely. She smiled at the memory. Course, she also said a woman who could shoot straight would never be helpless, so I learned that too. The first word from Griff in an hour came as she was browning the meat. "Good." She glanced over her shoulder and found him nodding approvingly at her mention of shooting. It occurred to her that he would naturally approve of practical skills, of self-reliance. He'd been protecting himself for 16 years, of course. He'd want a partner who could do the same. As the stew simmered, filling the cabin with rich, savory aromas, Lila began the delicate work of making the space more livable without overwhelming her new husband. From another bag, she produced a set of blue-checked curtains she'd made for her room at the stage stop. "These might help," she said, holding them up to the windows. "Cut down on the glare without blocking the view." Griff considered this, then moved to help her hang them. Working together in the small space required a dance of sorts. She would step aside to let his greater height reach the high corners, while he would retreat to give her room to adjust the fabric. Their hands brushed occasionally as they worked, and each time Lila felt him tense slightly, as if human contact was something he had to consciously allow. When they finished, the transformation was immediate. The harsh afternoon light became golden and warm, and the cabin felt less like a fort and more like a home. "Better," Griff said, and she heard something like wonder in his voice. The evening meal was a revelation for both of them. Lila had set the table with care, using 2 plates she'd brought from town since Griff apparently owned only one of everything. She'd found a few wildflowers growing near the cabin, and arranged them in a tin cup as a centerpiece. Simple touches, but they changed the entire character of the space. Griff sat across from her, his massive frame making the chair look like it belonged in a child's playhouse. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not just the food, but the entire experience of sharing a meal with another person. "You're a fine cook," he said finally, the words coming easier now. "Thank you." She smiled at him across the table. "It's been a while since I cooked for someone who appreciated it." They ate in comfortable silence after that, but it was different from the oppressive quiet that had filled the cabin before. This was the companionable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. After dinner, as Lila washed the dishes in the basin by the window, she became aware that Griff was moving around the cabin with unusual purpose. When she turned, she found that he'd dragged an old trunk from beneath the bed and was pulling out blankets and pillows. "I'll take the floor," he said, not meeting her eyes. "You should have the bed." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her more than grand romantic declarations might have. Here was a man who understood that trust had to be built slowly, that comfort came from knowing your boundaries would be respected. "That's kind of you," she said. "But the floor's no place for a man your size. We can share the bed like civilized people. I trust you to be a gentleman." The look he gave her was full of gratitude and something else, relief. Perhaps that she wasn't afraid of him. As the sun set and the cabin settled into evening quiet, they worked out the logistics of sharing space. Lila would change behind the hanging blanket Griff rigged up for privacy. He would bank the fire and check the doors while she prepared for bed. Simple routines, but they established the rhythm of a partnership. That first night, lying in the narrow bed with Griff's solid presence beside her, Lila stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling and marveled at how her life had changed in a single day. This morning she'd been a frightened widow, facing an impossible choice. Tonight she was Mrs. Griffin McAllister, sharing a bed with the most feared man in 3 territories, and somehow feeling safer than she had in months. Griff's breathing was deep and steady beside her, but she sensed he wasn't sleeping any more than she was. The adjustment would take time for both of them. But the stew had been good. The cabin felt warmer with her things in it. And outside, the night sounds of the canyon created a peaceful backdrop to their new beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Clayton Murdoch wouldn't simply accept defeat, and the town would have plenty to say about their hasty marriage. But tonight, for the first time in 16 years, Griff McAllister's bed wasn't empty, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating. 3 days into their marriage, Lila found the hat. She'd been cleaning out the cabin's single closet, making room for her own clothes, when her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth on the highest shelf. Standing on her toes, she managed to work it free, and the bundle fell open in her hands to reveal a battered cowboy hat, its leather band dark with old sweat and wear. But it was too small for Griff. This hat would have fit a younger man, someone with a slighter build, and she realized with a catch in her throat, someone who would never grow old enough to need a larger size. That was Jake's. Griff's voice from the doorway made her jump. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, raw grief, mixed with something that might have been relief. "Your brother," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He nodded, stepping into the cabin and closing the door behind him. For 3 days, they'd been dancing around the deeper truths of their lives, settling into domestic routines while carefully avoiding the painful territories of their pasts. But the hat had torn down that careful boundary. He was always losing it, Griff said, his voice rough with memory. Mama used to scold him something fierce about taking care of his things. But Jake, he'd get distracted by a butterfly or an interesting rock, and that hat would end up hanging on a fence post somewhere. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I must have ridden back over our old trails 100 times looking for that hat. Lila held the worn leather gently, as if it were made of spun glass. How old was he? 22. The words came out hard, like stones dropped into still water. Old enough to think he was invincible, young enough to still believe the world was fair. She waited, sensing there was more. Griff moved to the window, staring out at the canyon walls, as if he could see the past written in their ancient stone. The morning they came for us, Jake was reading his Bible, always did that after breakfast said. It set his mind right for the day ahead. He was on Ecclesiastes, the part about there being a time for everything under heaven. Griff's hands gripped the window frame. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to harvest. He never got to finish the passage, Lila said quietly. Griff turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his pale eyes. How did you? Because you carry that kind of pain in your shoulders, she said. And because I know what it's like to have the last conversation with someone you love cut short by violence. Her first husband, Thomas, had been gunned down by road agents while carrying the stage stop's weekly receipts to the bank. He'd been in the middle of telling her about his plans to expand their business when the shots rang out from the rocks above the trail. She'd found his body still clutching the letter he'd been writing to his sister back east, the ink not yet dry on the words, "Lila and I have been talking about starting a family." "I'm sorry," Griff said, and she heard genuine compassion in his voice. "And I'm sorry about Jake." She held up the hat. "Would you like me to put this back?" "No." The answer came quickly, as if he'd already been thinking about it. "He'd have liked you, would have teased me something fierce about finding myself a wife, but he'd have approved." Griff moved closer, reaching out to touch the hat's worn brim. Maybe it's time his thing saw daylight again. That evening, as they shared another meal across the small table, Griff began to talk. Not in the easy flow of a man comfortable with conversation, but in the careful, deliberate way of someone opening a door that had been locked for too long. He told her about their childhood on a small ranch outside of Silver Creek, how their parents had died in a wagon accident when Jake was barely 16, leaving Griff to raise his younger brother alone. How they'd built their reputation together, Griff's skill with a gun balanced by Jake's gift with people and numbers. "We were going to buy land up north," he said, his fork moving food around his plate without eating. "Jake had it all figured out, how many cattle we could run, what it would cost to build a proper house, even picked out names for the horses we'd breed." His voice dropped. He had big dreams for such a young man. "Dreams aren't foolish just because they don't come true," Lila said. "They're only foolish if we never dare to have them." Something in his expression shifted at her words, as if she'd given him permission to remember his brother with fondness instead of only grief. Later, as they prepared for bed, Griff surprised her by speaking again. "Clayton Murdoch rode by today while you were at the spring." Lila's hands stilled on the buttons of her dress. "What did he want?" "To congratulate me on my marriage." The words dripped with bitter irony. "Said he hoped I'd be happy with my new wife for as long as it lasted." A chill ran down Lila's spine. She'd been expecting retaliation, but the reality of it made her mouth go dry. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Murdoch's too smart for direct threats. He lets his meaning be understood without saying anything that could be repeated in court." Griff's jaw tightened, but the message was clear enough. "He's not done with us." That night, Lila lay awake listening to the sounds of the canyon. An owl called from somewhere up the ridge, and the wind sighed through the pines. Beside her, Griff's breathing was slow and steady, but she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he wasn't sleeping either. "Griff," she whispered. "Hmm? Whatever comes, we'll face it together." His hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Together," he agreed, and the word carried the weight of a sacred vow. In the morning, she woke to find Jake's hat hanging on a peg by the door, where it caught the early sunlight streaming through her blue-checked curtains. It seemed right somehow, as if the younger McAllister brother was blessing their new beginning. And when Griff saw her notice the hat, he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since their wedding day. "Figured it was time," he said simply. Lila rose and kissed his cheek, the gesture becoming more natural each time. "Jake would be proud of you." "Maybe," Griff said, settling the hat more firmly on its peg. "But I think he'd be prouder that I finally found someone brave enough to share my empty bed." The words were said lightly, but they carried depths of meaning that made Lila's heart skip. They were building something here, she realized. Something that had started as a business arrangement, but was growing into something much more precise: a partnership built on mutual respect, shared burdens, and the gradual healing of old wounds. Outside, the canyon was waking up to another day, and whatever challenges it might bring, they would meet them as they had everything else together. The first time Griff touched her with desire rather than mere courtesy, they were working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a late summer storm. Lila was holding a post steady while he hammered, and when she adjusted her grip, her hand brushed against his forearm. Instead of the usual brief contact followed by his quick withdrawal, his skin lingered against hers. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something different in his pale eyes, warmth that had been growing slowly over their weeks together, fed by shared meals, comfortable silences, and the gradual erosion of the walls they'd both built around their hearts. "Lila," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither had dared to name. Then the sound of approaching horses broke the spell, and they stepped apart, just as 3 of Clayton Murdoch's men crested the ridge. The lead rider was a thin, weasel-faced man named Silas Crenshaw, who served as Murdoch's foreman and chief intimidator. The other 2 were hired musclemen with cold eyes and practiced sneers, who made their living with violence. "McAllister," Crenshaw called out, reining in his horse 20 feet away. "Mr. Murdoch sent us to check on you and your new bride. Make sure you're settling in well to married life." Griff moved subtly to place himself between Lila and the riders. She felt the change in him immediately, the easy companionship of moments before, replaced by the coiled readiness of a man prepared for trouble. "We're settling just fine," Griff said, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous tone she'd heard hints of before, but never fully experienced. Crenshaw's gaze shifted to Lila, running over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. McAllister, you're looking well. Course, marriage agrees with some women more than others. Some find it confining. I find it liberating," Lila replied calmly, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "There's nothing quite like having a partner you can depend on." One of the other men, a thick-necked brute with scarred knuckles, leaned forward in his saddle. "Word in town is you 2 barely know each other. Mighty quick courtship for folks planning to spend their lives together." "Sometimes when you know, Lila said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Crenshaw's laugh was like the sound of grinding metal. "Well, ain't that romantic? Mr. Murdoch will be pleased to hear you're so satisfied with your arrangement." His gaze shifted back to Griff. "Course, he's also interested in that boundary dispute you had with the Hendersons last month. Seems like there might be some question about where your property lines actually run." Griff went very still. "No question at all. Been surveyed twice." "Funny thing about surveys," Crenshaw said, patting his saddlebags. "Sometimes they get lost. Sometimes new ones turn up that tell a different story altogether." The threat was clear as daylight. Murdoch was planning to manufacture a legal challenge to Griff's land ownership, the same way he'd been pressuring other small ranchers throughout the territory. It was a patient man's approach to theft use, the law as a weapon, while maintaining the pretense of respectability. "You boys best be moving along," Griff said, his hand resting casually on the hammer handle. "Afternoon's getting on, and these mountains can be dangerous after dark." The words were polite enough, but something in Griff's tone made the horses fidget nervously. Even the animals could sense the predator that lived beneath his civilized veneer. Crenshaw gathered his reins, but his smirk never wavered. "We'll be seeing you again real soon, McAllister, you and your lovely wife." He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Ma'am." They rode away at a leisurely pace, making it clear they weren't intimidated, but Lila noticed they kept looking back over their shoulders until they were well out of rifle range. "How bad is it?" she asked when they were alone again. Griff was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on bitter medicine. "Bad," he said finally. "Murdoch's not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. He'll keep pushing until he gets what he wants, or what?" His pale eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of 16 years of self-imposed isolation in their depths. Or until someone stops him permanently. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Lila found herself studying her husband with new eyes. The lamplight played across his strong features, highlighting the scars that marked his hands and face like a roadmap of old battles. She'd grown accustomed to his size, his quiet strength, his careful way of moving through the world. But tonight she was seeing the man he'd been before tragedy had driven him into exile. "Tell me about your first marriage," he said suddenly, as if he'd been reading her thoughts. The request surprised her. In all their conversations about their pasts, they'd touched only lightly on the losses that had shaped them. But perhaps it was time for deeper truths. "Thomas was a good man," she said, settling back in her chair. "Kind, honest, hard-working. We met when he started the stage line through Bitter Creek. I was working at the hotel then, and he'd always stop to talk when he was in town." She smiled at the memory. "He courted me for 6 months before he worked up the nerve to ask for my hand." "Did you love him?" The question was asked quietly, without jealousy, but she sensed her answer mattered to him. "I did," she said honestly. "Not the wild, desperate kind of love you read about in novels, but a steady, comfortable affection that grew stronger every day. He made me feel safe, valued. We were building something together." Griff nodded slowly. "That's a rare thing." "Yes, it is." She paused, then asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "What about you? Was there ever anyone before?" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Once." His voice was so quiet, she had to lean forward to hear him. "Her name was Sarah, doctor's daughter from Silver Creek. We were planning to marry after Jake and I got established." "What happened?" "The feud happened. After Jake died, after I took my oath of silence, she tried to wait for me. Tried to understand why I couldn't be the man she'd fallen in love with anymore." His hands clenched in his lap. "But how could I ask her to share this life? The loneliness, the silence, the constant looking over my shoulder for Murdoch's next move. So you let her go." "I drove her away," he corrected. "Made sure she understood there was no future with me. She married a banker from Helena 2 years later. Has 3 children now, from what I hear." The pain in his voice was fresh, despite the years that had passed. Lila reached across the space between their chairs and covered his hands with hers. "You were protecting her," she said, "just like you're protecting me now." "Am I?" He turned his hands palm up, capturing her fingers in his. "Or am I being selfish, keeping you here when Murdoch's attention could get you killed?" The warmth of his touch was traveling up her arms, creating a flutter of sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing attraction she'd been trying to ignore. "That's my choice to make," she said firmly, "and I choose to stay." Something shifted in his expression, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I never thought I'd want to touch someone again. Never thought I'd care about anything beyond getting through each day." His thumb traced across her knuckles. "But you make me want things I gave up hoping for 16 years ago." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But the foundation was there now, built on mutual respect, shared danger, and the slow recognition that what had started as a marriage of convenience was becoming something much more powerful, a genuine partnership between 2 wounded souls who'd found healing in each other's company. The photograph was tucked inside an old copy of Pilgrim's Progress that Lila found while organizing Griff's small collection of books. It fluttered to the floor when she opened the volume, landing face down on the rough wooden planks. She almost didn't look. After weeks of marriage, she'd learned to respect the boundaries of Griff's privacy, understanding that some wounds needed to heal at their own pace. But something about the careful way the photograph had been placed, not hidden, exactly, but protected, made her curious. When she turned it over, her breath caught. The image was cracked down the middle and water-stained around the edges, but she could still make out 4 figures posed in front of a modest ranch house. A stern-faced man with Griff's strong jaw and pale eyes. A small, dark-haired woman with laugh lines around her mouth. A younger version of Griff, barely out of his teens but already towering over his family. And beside him, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, grinning at the camera with the kind of infectious joy that made you smile just looking at him. "That's us," Griff said from the doorway, his voice soft with memory. "Last Christmas before Ma and Pa died." Lila looked up to find him watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, vulnerable, almost shy, as if he were sharing his most precious treasure. "Jake insisted we hire that traveling photographer," he continued, moving into the room. "Cost us near a week's wages, but he said we needed something to remember the good times by." His mouth quirked in a sad smile. Turned out he was right, though not for the reasons he thought. She studied the photograph more carefully, noting the way young Griff's hand rested protectively on his brother's shoulder, the obvious affection between the family members, the hope and confidence that radiated from their faces. "Your mother was beautiful," she said. Jake took after her, had her smile, her way of seeing the best in people. Griff sat beside her on the bed, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Pa used to say Jake could charm the bark off a tree if he set his mind to it. And you took after your father?" "In looks, maybe. But Pa had a gentleness about him that I never learned. He could settle a spooked horse with just his voice, calm a crying baby by holding it just so." Griff's hands flexed unconsciously. "These hands were made for violence, always have been." "That's not true," Lila said firmly, setting the photograph carefully on the bedside table. "These hands have been nothing but gentle with me." The statement hung between them, charged with significance. Over the weeks of their marriage, she'd become acutely aware of Griff's careful restraint, the way he always asked permission before touching her, how he modulated his strength so as never to cause her the slightest discomfort. "I've been thinking," she said, her heart suddenly racing with the boldness of what she was about to suggest, "about what you said the other night, about wanting things you'd given up hoping for." Griff went very still beside her. "Lila, I want them too," she continued quickly, before her courage could fail her. "The touching, the closeness, the partnership that goes deeper than contracts and convenience." She turned to face him fully. "I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." For a moment, she thought he might retreat into his old silences. The conflict was written clearly across his features, desire warring with duty, hope struggling against fear. Then he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back to what we were before." "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "Do you?" His answer was a kiss that spoke of 16 years of loneliness, of careful courtship and growing trust, of two damaged souls finding healing in each other's arms. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you," he said, the words emerging like a confession torn from the depths of his heart. "God help me, I love you more than I thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, marveling at how natural the words felt. "My silent, gentle giant who speaks volumes without saying a word." What followed was a joining that transformed them both. Where there had been careful distance, now there was intimate closeness. Where there had been polite courtesy, now there was passionate connection. They moved together with the deliberate care of people who understood the preciousness of what they were sharing, taking time to learn each other's rhythms and responses. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Lila felt as though she'd been reborn. The damaged photograph on the bedside table seemed to smile down at them, as if the McAllister family was blessing this new chapter in their story. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her head pillowed on Griff's broad chest. His arms tightened around her. "Now we build something worth fighting for," he said. "And when Murdoch comes, because he will come, we'll be ready for him." The next morning brought news that proved Griff's prediction correct. Tom Henderson, their nearest neighbor, rode up to the cabin with his hat in his hands and worry etched deep in his weathered features. Griff, Lila, he greeted them, accepting a cup of coffee with grateful hands. I'm afraid I've got bad news. Murdoch's been to see the territorial judge about boundary disputes in this valley. Word is he's got documentation that calls into question most of the property lines hereabouts. Lila felt her blood run cold. This was worse than she'd expected, not just a personal vendetta, but a systematic attempt to steal land from every independent rancher in the area. How many families? Griff asked, his voice deadly calm. Near a dozen so far. The Hendersons, the Crawfords, the Murphy clan up north. Anyone who's refused to sell out to Murdoch's operation. Tom shook his head. He's being real clever about it too, using the law instead of guns, making it look all legal and proper. What does he want? Lila asked, though she suspected she already knew. Same thing he's always wanted, complete control of this valley. With all the independent operators gone, he'll own every ranch, every water source, every passage between the mining camps and the railroad. Tom's expression was grim. Man like that gets that kind of power, there's no stopping him. After Tom left, Griff stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the canyon walls that had sheltered him for 16 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a momentous decision. It's time, he said simply. Time for what? He turned to face her, and in his pale eyes she saw the man he'd been before. Grief and guilt had driven him into exile, the fastest gun in 3 territories, the protector of the innocent, the McAllister brother, who'd sworn to build something good in this harsh land. Time to stop running, he said. Time to speak up for what's right. Time to remember that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Looking at him, no, her husband, her lover, her partner, in all things Lila felt a fierce surge of pride. The silent hermit of Bitter Creek Canyon was finally ready to break his silence, and when he did, Clayton Murdoch was going to learn exactly what he'd made an enemy of. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a nervous young man from the territorial post office who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than riding up to the hermit's cabin. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his hands shook as he held out the official-looking envelope. Mr. McAllister, this came in on yesterday's stage, marked urgent. The boy's voice cracked on the last word. Griff took the letter with a frown, noting the expensive paper and the unfamiliar seal pressed into red wax. The return address made his blood run cold. Murdoch Holdings, Territorial Office, Helena. Thank you, he told the boy, who was already wheeling his horse around for a hasty retreat. Lila emerged from the cabin, drawn by the sound of voices. She took one look at Griff's face and knew immediately that whatever was in that envelope, it wasn't good news. What is it? She asked. Instead of answering, Griff broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As he read, his expression grew darker with each passing second. When he finished, he wordlessly handed the document to his wife. The letter was written in the formal, intimidating language of legal correspondence, but its meaning was crystal clear. Clayton Murdoch's attorneys were claiming that the original land grants for the McAllister property, indeed, for most of the independent holdings in Bitter Creek Canyon, had been issued in error. They were demanding that all affected parties appear in territorial court within 30 days to defend their claims or forfeit their land to the rightful owner. This is impossible, Lila said, scanning the document again. Your family's been on this land for over 20 years. The grants were issued legally, surveyed properly. Read the signature, Griff said grimly. She looked at the bottom of the letter and felt her heart stop. The challenge was being filed on behalf of Murdoch Holdings by the law firm of Blackwood Crane. Associate Sand, the signature at the bottom, belonged to James Crane, Esquire. The same James Crane who had been the Territorial Land Commissioner 16 years ago. The same James Crane who had issued the original McAllister land grant. The same James Crane who had, apparently, been bought and paid for by Clayton Murdoch long before anyone realized what was happening. He's been planning this for 16 years, Griff said, his voice flat with the weight of terrible understanding. Maybe longer. But it was what Lila found tucked behind the legal document that turned her blood to ice water. A second letter, this one written in Murdoch's own hand, addressed to Griff personally. McAllister. By now you've read the legal papers and understand that your time on my land is coming to an end. But I thought you might be interested in some additional information that my attorneys didn't see fit to include in their formal filing. Do you remember the morning your brother died? How surprised you were that my men knew exactly where to find you, how they seemed to know about the weapons cache you thought was so well hidden, how they anticipated every defensive position you and Jake tried to take. That's because someone told them where to look. Someone who knew your habits, your hiding places, your weaknesses better than anyone else in the world. Someone who owed me a very large gambling debt and was willing to pay it off with information. Jake didn't die in a random land dispute, Griffin. He died because someone he trusted sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. Someone who sat in your cabin, ate your food, called you brother, and then rode straight to me with everything he knew about your defenses. I'll let you guess who it was. But I will say this, he died badly 6 months later when he tried to blackmail me for more money. Some people never learn when to stop pushing their luck. Your loving neighbor, Clayton Murdoch. P.S. Give my regards to your lovely wife. I do hope she's more loyal than your previous associates. The letter fell from Lila's nerveless fingers. She stared at her husband, watching the color drain from his face as the implications sank in. "Who?" she whispered. "Tom Patterson." Griff's voice was barely audible. "My partner, Jake's best friend since childhood. The man who taught him to shoot, who helped us plan our defense strategies, who—" He broke off, his hands clenching into fists. "Who I trusted with our lives." The revelation hit Lila like a physical blow. For 16 years, Griff had lived with the guilt of failing to protect his brother. For 16 years, he'd blamed himself for not being fast enough, smart enough, careful enough to prevent Jake's death. For 16 years, he'd carried the weight of believing that his reputation as a gunfighter had brought violence to his family's door. But it had all been a lie. Jake had died not because of Griff's enemies, but because of his friends. Not because of a random land dispute, but because of a calculated betrayal, orchestrated by the very man who was now trying to steal their home. "The oath," Lila said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "The silence. You weren't just grieving, you were trying to punish yourself for a crime you didn't commit." Griff nodded slowly, his face a mask of anguish. 16 years of silence for a betrayal I never saw coming. 16 years of isolation because I was too proud to see that the enemy was already inside our walls. But even as the weight of the revelation settled over them, Lila found herself thinking about the implications. If Murdoch had orchestrated Jake's death 16 years ago, if he'd been planning this land grab for decades, then the current crisis wasn't just about greed, it was about finishing what he'd started. "This isn't just about the land," she said slowly. "This is personal. He's been planning your destruction since before Jake died." "Why?" The question burst out of Griff like a dam breaking. "What did I ever do to warrant this kind of hatred?" Lila thought about everything she'd learned about Clayton Murdoch over the years she's pried, his need to control everything and everyone around him, his inability to tolerate any challenge to his authority. "You were better than him," she said simply, "faster with a gun, more respected by the community, more successful, despite having fewer advantages. Men like Murdoch can't stand being shown up, especially by someone they consider beneath them." The analysis felt right, but it also made their situation even more dire. This wasn't a business dispute that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. This was a blood feud, disguised as a legal proceeding, and Murdoch wouldn't be satisfied until Griff was completely destroyed. "What do we do?" she asked. For a long moment, Griff didn't answer. He stood at the window, staring out at the canyon that had been his refuge for so long, his shoulders rigid with the weight of accumulated anger and betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, more focused, carrying the ring of absolute determination. "We fight," he said, "not just for our land, but for everyone in this valley who's been living under Murdoch's shadow. Tom Patterson might have sold us out 16 years ago, but there are still good people here worth protecting." He turned to face her, and Lila saw that something fundamental had changed in her husband. The guilt that had driven him into exile was gone, burned away by the revelation of Murdoch's deception. In its place was a cold, focused rage that made her remember why people had once feared the name Griffin McAllister. "He wants to finish what he started," Griff continued. "But he made one mistake. He let me live long enough to learn the truth. And now that I know what really happened to Jake, I'm going to make sure Clayton Murdoch pays for every year of silence he stole from me." The blood feud metaphor, that's what it truly was. Despite its legal trapping, Shad accomplished something Murdoch probably hadn't intended. Instead of breaking Griff's spirit, it had freed him from the guilt that had kept him silent for 16 years. The hermit of Bitter Creek Canyon was done hiding. The fastest gun in 3 territories was about to remind the world why his reputation had once made strong men step aside. And Clayton Murdoch was going to learn the hard way that some sleeping giants should never be awakened. The weight of his father's gun felt like redemption itself as Griff lifted it from the oiled cloth where it had waited 16 long years. The Colt 45 was a work of art, custom grips, worn smooth by 3 generations of McAllister hands, the barrel perfectly balanced, every mechanism maintained with the devotion of men who understood that their lives might depend on this weapon's reliability. "I thought I'd never see you wear that again," Lila said from the doorway, her voice soft with wonder and something that might have been relief. Griff turned the gun over in his hands, reacquainting himself with its familiar weight and balance. "My grandfather carried this at Gettysburg. My father used it to protect our family from road agents and claim jumpers. I learned to shoot with it when I was barely tall enough to hold it steady." He slid it into the holster with practiced ease. Maybe it's time it served its purpose again. The transformation was immediate and profound. Where moments before there had stood a gentle rancher and loving husband, now there was something altogether more dangerous, the man whose reputation had once made grown men cross the street rather than risk his displeasure. The fastest gun in 3 territories, risen from 16 years of self-imposed exile. "How does it feel?" Lila asked, studying his face for any sign of the guilt or reluctance that had defined him for so long. "Like coming home to myself," he admitted, surprising them both with the truth of it. "I thought that part of me was dead, buried with Jake, but it was just sleeping, waiting for something worth waking up for." The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation that had transformed Bitter Creek Canyon from a collection of isolated homesteads into something resembling a military camp. Word of Murdoch's legal challenge had spread through the valley like wildfire, and the response had been swift and uncompromising. Tom Henderson, despite his 73 years and the rheumatism that stiffened his joints, had assumed command of the valley's defense with the authority of a man who'd fought in 3 Indian wars and knew how to organize ordinary citizens into an effective fighting force. "Murdoch's got numbers," the old rancher had explained during their strategy meeting at his ranch. "But we've got advantages, he don't. We know every rock, every tree, every hiding place in these mountains. We're fighting for our homes, our families, our very right to exist. That's worth more than all the hired guns in the territory." The Crawford brothers had contributed their expertise with explosives, legacy of their years working the silver mines up north. "We can bring down half the canyon walls if we place the charges right," the elder brother had explained, his scarred hands sketching diagrams in the dirt. "Funnel them into a killing ground where our rifles can do the most good." Even Preacher Walsh had surprised everyone by volunteering for combat duty. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he declared, producing a well-maintained shotgun from beneath his pulpit. "And sometimes he works through 12-gauge shells and righteous determination." But it was Doc Brennan's quiet contribution that had moved Griff the most. The elderly physician had approached him privately, carrying a small leather pouch. "Been saving these for a special occasion," the old man had said, opening the pouch to reveal a dozen cartridges with specially modified tips. "Learned to make them during the war. They'll punch through armor like it was paper, drop a man even if you don't hit him square." "Doc, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." The doctor's eyes had been hard as winter ice. "Murdoch killed my son-in-law 2 years back. Made it look like an accident, but I know better. This is personal for all of us, Griff. That snake's been poisoning this valley for too long. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the canyon walls, Griff and Lila stood on their porch, making their final preparations for what everyone understood would be a fight to the death. Tomorrow, Murdoch would come with his army of hired killers. Tomorrow, the shooting would start. 13 of us against what, 25, 30 professionals? Lila was checking her rifle one final time, the Winchester that had belonged to her first husband. Those aren't encouraging odds. No, Griff agreed, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what they faced. But we have things they don't. We're fighting on ground we know like the back of our hands. We're protecting everything we hold dear. And most importantly, he turned to look at her, his pale eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. We're not expecting to walk away from this. The statement hung heavy in the evening air. They'd both accepted that tomorrow would likely bring death to Bitter Creek Canyon. The only questions were how many of Murdoch's men they could take with them, and whether their sacrifice would inspire others to continue the fight. "Do you have any regrets?" Lila asked softly, "about this path we've chosen?" Griff considered the question seriously, his gaze moving across the canyon that had been his refuge for so long. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret that it took me 16 years to remember who I was supposed to be. Jake would have been proud to see me wearing this gun again, fighting for something that matters." She moved closer, until she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Tell me about him, about Jake, not the way he died, but the way he lived." A smile transformed Griff's scarred features, and for a moment the years fell away from his face. He was sunshine in human form. Always laughing, always seeing the best in people, always convinced that tomorrow would be better than today. He had this way of making everyone around him feel like they were part of something important, something good. "He sounds wonderful." He was, and he believed in justice, in standing up for folks who couldn't stand up for themselves. "That's what we're doing tomorrow, finishing the work Jake started before Murdoch's bullet cut him down." As darkness settled over the canyon, they made their final rounds, checking defensive positions and reassuring the other families who'd chosen to stay and fight. Mrs. Henderson was loading ammunition with the efficient precision of a woman who'd lived through 3 decades of frontier violence. The remaining Crawford brother was testing fuses and timer mechanisms with the care of a man whose life depended on his explosives working perfectly. "Everyone knows their positions," Tom Henderson reported when they gathered for a final strategy meeting. "First light, we'll have lookouts on Eagle Peak and Widow's Point. Soon as they spot Murdoch's force entering the canyon, they'll signal with 3 rifle shots. That gives us maybe 10 minutes to get into position before the shooting starts." "What about the families with children?" Lila asked. "Already sent them out yesterday night, went to relatives in Silver Creek and beyond. Whatever happens tomorrow, the young ones will be safe." Griff nodded approvingly. This wasn't about revenge or hatred, it was about protecting innocent people from a man who used violence and intimidation to steal what others had built with honest labor. As the meeting broke up and people drifted back to their homes for what might be their last night of peace, Griff and Lila walked hand in hand through the moonlight to their cabin. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by months of shared journeys, but tonight every step felt precious and significant. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Griff said as they paused on their porch, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back my voice, my purpose, my reason for living. If we fall tomorrow, we fall together, and that's more than I ever dared hope for during all those years of silence." "We won't fall," Lila replied with fierce conviction. "We can't. Too many people are depending on us, and Jake's memory deserves better than defeat." Inside their home, they made love with the desperate passion of people who understood how precious and fragile life could be. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a vow that whatever came with the dawn, they would face it united in purpose and strengthened by a love that had transformed them both. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the canyon, Griff found himself thinking not of death and violence, but of the future they were fighting to protect. A future where children could grow up without fear, where honest people could build something good without having it stolen by men like Clayton Murdoch. "Are you ready?" Lila whispered in the darkness. "I'm ready," he replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The silent hermit of Bitter Creek Canyon had found his voice at last. Tomorrow, the world would hear it roar. The signal came at dawn 3, sharp rifle cracks echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Griff was already dressed and armed, had been for hours, but the sound still sent adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. "They're coming," he said, though Lila had heard the shots too. Through their window, they could see dust rising from the canyon flora, lot of dust, kicked up by more horses than Griff had expected. Murdoch wasn't taking any chances this time. He'd brought an army to finish what he'd started 16 years ago. "How many?" Lila asked, checking her rifle one final time. Griff squinted through the early morning light, counting the riders streaming into the canyon. His heart sank as the numbers climbed. 30, maybe more. He's brought every gunfighter between here and Denver. But even as the odds stacked impossibly against them, Griff felt something he hadn't experienced in 16 years, the calm clarity that came with righteous purpose. He wasn't the guilt-ridden hermit anymore, wasn't the broken man who'd hidden in silence and shame. He was Griffin McAllister, protector of the innocent, and he had work to do. The badge, Sheriff Morrison, had pressed into his hands the night before, felt heavy in his shirt pocket. "Make it official," the old lawman had said. "You're my deputy now, with full authority to enforce territorial law in this county." It was a symbolic gesture more than anything else. They all knew the sheriff wouldn't live to testify about jurisdictional niceties, but it mattered. Nonetheless. "Time to go," Griff said, kissing Lila deeply. "Stay behind the rocks like we planned. Don't try to be a hero." "Same to you," she replied, though they both knew he was about to do exactly the opposite. They separated at the door, Lila heading for the defensive position they'd prepared among the boulders above the cabin, Griff walking down the slope toward the canyon floor where Murdoch's army was forming up. He could see the man himself now, sitting his horse in the center of the formation like a general preparing for battle. Clayton Murdoch was everything Griff remembered, and worsy, thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s, dressed in expensive clothes that couldn't hide the cruelty in his pale eyes. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real opposition, who believed that money and violence could solve any problem. Behind him rode the enforcement arm of his empire. Professional killers, every one of them, men who sold their guns to the highest bidder and slept soundly after murdering families for the crime of standing in their employer's way. Griff recognized several faces from wanted posters: Jack, the Snake Morrison, wanted for killing a territorial judge; Miguel Santos, the Mexican gunfighter who'd murdered an entire family in Colorado; Deadeye, Danny Ferguson, who collected ears as trophies. They reined in 50 yards from where Griff stood waiting, and for a moment the canyon was absolutely silent, except for the creak of leather and the snorting of horses. Then Clayton Murdoch urged his mount forward, stopping just out of pistol range. "Griffin McAllister," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Been a long time." "Not long enough," Griff replied, and his voice rang with authority after 16 years of silence. Every word carried across the canyon like a bell, and he saw several of Murdoch's men shift nervously in their saddles. "I have legal papers," Murdoch continued, pulling a document from his saddlebags. "Court order requiring you and all the other squatters to vacate this land immediately. You can ride out peaceful-like, or we can drag your bodies out. Makes no difference to me." "I've seen your legal papers," Griff said, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Seen your letters too, the ones where you confessed to murdering my brother." A murmur ran through Murdoch's men. This wasn't what they'd expected. The hermit was supposed to be broken, defeated, easy to intimidate. Instead, they were facing a man who radiated dangerous confidence. "Jake's death was a tragedy," Murdoch said, but his smirk betrayed his words. "Perhaps if you'd been a better brother, a better protector." Perhaps if you'd been a better man, he'd still be alive. Griff took a step forward, and several of the hired guns reached for their weapons. But we both know what kind of man you are, Clayton, the kind who has to buy his victories because he's not strong enough to earn them. Murdoch's face flushed red with rage. "Kill him," he snarled to his men. "Kill them all." But before anyone could draw, Griff's voice rang out again, carrying the full weight of legal authority. "Clayton Murdoch, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, and 16 years of terrorizing the citizens of this territory." The sheriff's badge glinted in the morning sun as he pulled it from his pocket. "By the authority vested in me as a deputy sheriff of the Montana Territory, I order you to surrender yourself for trial." The absurdity of one man arresting 30 armed killers might have been laughable under other circumstances. But there was something in Griff's voice, something in his bearing, that made even hardened gunfighters hesitate. Murdoch recovered first, his laughter harsh and bitter. "You always were a fool, McAllister, just like your brother." That's when the shooting started. The first shot came from Deadeye, Danny Ferguson, his bullet whining past Griff's ear, close enough to burn. But Griff's return fire was faster, truer, and final. The legendary gunfighter crumpled without firing a second round. The canyon exploded into hell. Griff's Colt spoke again, and Jack, the Snake Morrison, pitched backward off his horse, clutching his chest. Two of Murdoch's best killers down in as many seconds, their reputations dying with them in the dust of Bitter Creek Canyon. From the ridges above, Tom Henderson's carefully positioned marksman opened fire with devastating effect. The old rancher's strategic genius became immediately apparent. Every angle of approach had been covered, every piece of cover mapped and targeted. Murdoch's men found themselves caught in a crossfire that turned the canyon floor into a killing ground. The Crawford brothers' dynamite charges detonated in sequence, bringing avalanches of rock cascading down the canyon walls. The explosions were perfectly timed to cut off retreat routes while funneling the surviving attackers into the prepared kill zones. Years of mining experience had taught them exactly where to place their charges for maximum effect. Preacher Walsh's shotgun boomed like divine judgment from his position behind the church, each blast accompanied by quotations from Scripture, delivered in a voice that carried clearly over the gunfire. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," he roared, dropping 2 men with a single shot, "and I shall repay." But Murdoch had brought professionals, men who'd survived dozens of battles through skill, cunning, and utter ruthlessness. They adapted quickly to the ambush, spreading out to minimize casualties, using their superior numbers to probe for weaknesses in the defense. Miguel Santos, the Mexican gunfighter, worked his way up the eastern slope with 3 others, trying to flank the defenders. But Doc Brennan was waiting in his cave position, and his specially modified bullets proved their worth. The first shot punched through Santos's shoulder, spinning him around. The second dropped one of his companions with authority that spoke of military training from decades past. "Come on, you bastards," the old doctor shouted, working his rifle bolt with mechanical precision. "I've got medicine for all of you." The battle swayed back and forth across the canyon floor with savage intensity. Neither side gave quarter, both understanding that this fight would end only when one group was completely destroyed. The air filled with gunsmoke so thick it became difficult to distinguish friend from enemy at more than 20 yards. Griff moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his 16 years of enforced peace falling away as if they'd never existed. Every lesson learned in 2 decades of gunfighting returned to him with crystal clarity. He rolled behind a fallen log as bullets splintered the wood above his head, came up firing, and sent another of Murdoch's hired killers tumbling from his saddle. From her position among the rocks above, Lila's Winchester barked with methodical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed, each bullet meant to protect not just her husband, but the entire community they'd sworn to defend. The rifle had belonged to her first husband, but desperation and love had transformed her into something deadly and efficient. "That's for threatening my neighbors," she called out as another of Murdoch's men fell. And that's for 16 years of terrorizing good people. But gradually, inevitably, the numbers began to tell. Tom Henderson took a bullet through the shoulder and could barely hold his rifle steady. One of the Crawford brothers lay motionless behind his rocky barricade, his life's blood seeping into the hard-packed earth. Even Preacher Walsh was down, pressing a hand to a leg wound while trying to reload his shotgun with shaking fingers. The defenders' ammunition was running low, their positions compromised by sustained fire from professional killers who knew their business. Griff found himself pressed back toward the cabin, facing 7 or 8 surviving gunfighters who had him pinned down with coordinated fire. This was how it would end, he realized, not in a blaze of glory, but ground down by superior numbers and professional competence. He thought of Jake, of the dreams they'd shared, of the 16 years of silence that had led to this moment. Then Lila's scream cut through the gunfire like a blade. He spun to see Miguel Santos dragging her from her hiding place, the Mexican's wounded arm wrapped around her throat while his Colt pressed against her temple. Blood streamed from the buckshot wounds in his shoulder, but his gun hand remained steady as death. "Enough!" Santos roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Everyone stop shooting or the woman dies right now." The canyon fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the echo of ultimatum. In that terrible quiet, every eye focused on the tableau Lila, struggling against her captor's grip, the gun at her head, and Griff standing frozen with his Colt half raised. Clayton Murdoch emerged from behind an overturned wagon, his expensive clothes torn and powder-stained, but his pale eyes bright with vindictive triumph. In his hand, he clutched the Valley Deed, the legal document that would restore rightful ownership to every threatened family in the region. "It's over, McAllister," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "You fought better than I expected, killed more of my men than I thought possible. But mathematics don't lie. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options." "Let her go," Griff said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his heart. "Your fight is with me." "My fight is with anyone who stands in my way," Murdoch replied, waving the deed mockingly. "Your wife chose to take up arms against me. She accepts the consequences." He tore the document deliberately, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like dying hopes. "Just like all of you will accept the consequences of defying Clayton Murdoch." Griff's world narrowed to Lila's terrified face, and the gun pressed against her temple. After everything they'd been through, after finding love neither had expected, was it all going to end with surrender and execution? "You have 10 seconds, Murdoch continued. "Throw down your weapons and I'll make it quick. Keep fighting, and Santos here will demonstrate what happens to women who forget their place." That's when Griff noticed something that made his heart leap. Lila's eyes weren't filled with fear or pleading. Instead, she was looking past him with an expression of desperate hope, trying to communicate something without words. The distant thunder of approaching horses reached his ears just as understanding dawned. Murdoch heard it too, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. "What?" His question was answered by the appearance of riders streaming over the canyon rim like an avalanche of justice. Sheriff Morrison led them, sitting his horse with authority despite his age, a badge glinting on his chest and grim determination etched in every line of his weathered face. Behind him rode what looked like half the territory ranchers from neighboring valleys, townspeople from Bitter Creek, miners from the northern camps, even a squad of cavalry from Fort Brennan. Word of the siege had spread faster than wildfire, and the response had been overwhelming and decisive. "This is Sheriff Morrison." The old lawman's voice boomed across the canyon. "You men are surrounded and outnumbered 10 to 1. Throw down your weapons and surrender, or face the consequences." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Murdoch's surviving gunfighters, already shaken by the ferocity of the defenders' resistance, found themselves caught in a trap with no possibility of escape. In that moment of distraction, as every eye turned toward the approaching reinforcements, Lila acted with the courage that had first drawn Griff to her. She drove her elbow hard into Santos's wounded shoulder, and when he doubled over in agony, she twisted free and dove behind the nearest boulder. Griff's shot took the Mexican gunfighter through the heart before the man could recover his balance. The sound of that final gunshot seemed to echo forever in the suddenly quiet canyon. The remaining members of Murdoch's army threw down their weapons without being asked twice. Even professional killers knew when they were beaten, and the sight of 100 armed citizens converging on their position left no room for doubt about the outcome. Clayton Murdoch stood alone in the center of the canyon, his empire of fear and violence crumbling around him like a structure built on sand. The torn pieces of the Valley Deed lay scattered at his feet, but Griff knew there were copies, that the legal victory was as complete as the military one. "It's over, Clayton," Griff said, holstering his weapon and walking toward the man who'd caused 16 years of pain and silence. "Your reign of terror ends today." Sheriff Morrison's men quickly surrounded the surviving members of Murdoch's force, but the land baron himself seemed frozen in place, unable to accept the reality of his defeat. The man who'd terrorized an entire region for decades looked suddenly small and pathetic, stripped of his hired muscle and facing the wrath of every person he'd wronged. "This isn't possible," he whispered, staring at the ruined deed. "I had everything planned, everything in place." "You forgot one thing," Griff replied, gathering the torn fragments of the legal document. "You forgot that when good people stand together, they're stronger than any amount of money or hired violence. You forgot that some things are worth dying for, and that makes them worth living for too." As the dust settled and the wounded were tended, Lila ran to her husband's side. Their embrace was fierce and desperate, two people who'd come within moments of losing everything they'd fought so hard to build. "Is it really over?" she whispered against his chest. "It's over," he confirmed, his arms tightening around her. "Clayton Murdoch's time is finished, the valley is free, and it's going to stay that way." Around them, the people of Bitter Creek Canyon began emerging from their hiding places, blinking in the afternoon sunlight, like survivors of a long, dark winter finally seeing spring. Justice had come to the valley at last, carried on the wings of courage and community solidarity. The silence that had protected these mountains for so long had been shattered by gunfire, but in its place rose something better, the voices of free people celebrating their liberation, and the promise that good could triumph over evil when ordinary folks found the courage to stand together. The wedding rings caught the afternoon sunlight as Reverend Walsh blessed them, his voice stronger than it had been in years, despite the bandage around his wounded leg. They were simple gold bands, not the elaborate jewelry that wealth could buy, but they represented something far more precious, love freely given and joyfully received. "Do you, Griffin James McAllister, take Delilah Rose to be your wife in the sight of God and this community, to love and cherish her for all the days of your life?" "I do," Griff said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd gathered in the church. No hesitation this time, no rusty words forced from a reluctant throat. Just the firm commitment of a man who'd found his purpose and his partner. "And do you, Delilah Rose, take Griffin to be your husband, to stand beside him in times of trouble and times of joy, through whatever trials life may bring?" "I do," Lila replied, her eyes shining with tears of happiness as she looked up at the man who'd become her entire world. "Then, by the power vested in me and witnessed by this community that has stood together through fire and blood, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that followed was different from their first awkward peck in this same church months ago. This was the kiss of two people who'd been tested by the worst life could offer and had emerged stronger, their bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual sacrifice. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, a sound that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks before, when the shadow of Clayton Murdoch's tyranny had hung over the valley like a dark cloud. Murdoch himself was gone now, taken to the territorial capital in chains to face charges that would likely see him hanged. His surviving gunfighters had scattered to the winds, carrying word that Bitter Creek Canyon was no longer a place where hired killers could ply their trade with impunity. The legal challenges to the land grants had been withdrawn, the fraudulent documents exposed for what they were. But perhaps more importantly, the spirit of the community had been reborn. People who'd lived in fear for years now walked with their heads high, secure in the knowledge that they could depend on their neighbors when times got hard. Tom Henderson, his arm still in a sling from the battle wounds, served as Griff's best man. Doc Brennan, who'd surprised everyone by surviving 3 bullet wounds through sheer ornery determination, had insisted on attending despite his wife's protests. Even the Crawford brothers were there, both of them, thanks to Doc's skill with battlefield surgery and the good Lord's mercy. The reception was held at the Stage Stop, which Lila had transformed into a community gathering place where travelers and locals alike could find good food, honest company, and safety from the dangers of frontier life. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched and painted over, but she'd left one as a reminder, the shot that had come closest to killing her husband during the final battle. Helps folks remember, she'd explained when asked about it. Reminds them that freedom isn't free and that good people sometimes have to fight for what's right. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Griff found himself surrounded by children who'd grown up hearing whispered stories about the hermit of Bitter Creek Canyon. Now they pestered him with questions about his adventures, his guns, his legendary speed on the draw. "Tell us about the big fight, Mr. McAllister," young Billy Henderson demanded. "Tell us how you faced down 30 bad men all by yourself." "Wasn't by myself," Griff corrected gently, his arm around Lila's waist. "Had the finest partner a man could ask for and the best neighbors in the territory backing us up. The real lesson isn't about being fast with a goon, it's about knowing when something's worth fighting for and making sure you don't have to fight alone." Later, as the guests began to drift away and the lamp oil burned low, Griff and Lila walked home to their cabin, hand in hand. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by months of shared journeys between the Stage Stop and their mountain sanctuary. The cabin itself had grown over the summer. Griff had added a proper kitchen for his wife, a larger bedroom, and a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the canyon. Lila's curtains fluttered in the windows, and her flower garden bloomed beside the door. It was a home now, not just a shelter. "Any regrets?" Griff asked as they settled onto the porch swing he'd built for their first anniversary. "Only one," Lila replied, snuggling against his solid warmth. "I regret it took us so long to find each other." "Well, we found each other when we needed to," he said philosophically. "Maybe that's how these things are supposed to work." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had watched over countless other couples who dared to build something beautiful in this harsh but magnificent land. In the distance, they could hear the sound of music drifting up from the townfolks, still celebrating the victory that had freed them all from fear. "What do you think happens next?" Lila asked. "Next, Mrs. McAllister, we go inside and begin the rest of our lives together." Griff stood and offered her his hand, the same gesture he'd made on their wedding day months ago. "We've got a ranch to build, a community to help grow, and maybe, if we're very lucky, some little McAllisters to carry on the family name." "Maybe," she agreed, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. "But definitely we've got each other, and that's more than either of us dared hope for when this all started." As they walked into their home together, Griff paused to look back at the canyon one more time. 16 years of silence had ended, not with a whimper, but with a declaration of love that had echoed off these ancient walls and changed everything. His bed would never be empty again. His voice would never again be stilled by grief or guilt. And his heart, which had been as cold and barren as the winter mountains, now burned with a warmth that would last the rest of his days. Some questions, Griff realized, were worth waiting a lifetime to answer, especially when the answer was yes.